make sure this is recording. So go over the assignment one more time. You do have another couple of days to do it, a few days if you need. So that's fine. Let me get to it. Okay, so the assignment is in three parts, again, dealing with ISO, bracketing, and equivalent exposures. Let me go over the bracketing first, I guess. So here, can you guys all see these images?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I made 5 images. You don't have to do that. The middle one over here is the normal, and maybe you can see it says here 0 EV, which means that the that plus minus sign on the camera is set to 0, which means that I'm doing what the light meter said is correct. And it actually looks pretty good. There's detail in the shadows, although the deepest shadows are totally black. And the midtones look pretty good. The highlights are really bright. And again, the light meter has to make a choice. If it's going to expose correctly for the highlights, the really bright areas, then everything else will get too dark. If it exposes correctly for the shadow areas, then everything else will be too bright. So I did a +1 and a +2 and a -1 and a -2. So you don't have to do that. You can do +1 -1 or +2 -2. So again, the normal one is in the center. And if we go to the left, you can see it gets brighter. So I'm overexposing, and that means that I am exposing for the shadows. So here at +1, I've overexposed by 1 stop, and you can see the shadows better, definitely. They've opened up on the head here and even under this little fire pit a little bit. But the highlights have gotten even brighter, and they're starting to look really bad. There's no detail in them. Let me just go here. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. And this one's overexposed by 2 stops. And you can see it's really bright. Even the shadow areas, the dark areas, with the exception of here under the fire pit, even the dark areas on the cat are a little bit too light, and everything else is too bright as well. Let me bring up the information here. So can you guys see this information on the screen? It says DSC 0470 and so on.
Yes.
Okay, good. So this is in Lightroom, and I imported these images into Lightroom, and which we went over, and hopefully you have been doing. Excuse me. And if you click on the letter I on your keyboard, you can bring up information about your image. So let me just go over that right now. If you go to the pull down menu and you go to view and pull that down, about in the middle, it says grid and then loop. And grid, or the letter G you can use, brings up all of the images, either all of the images you have selected or all of the images in your grouping. So that can be either in the catalog, as you see on the left, all photographs. So now you can see all photographs. Or there are folders. These are the folders that I've imported into Lightroom. And I can then make collections if I want to from any of those images. All I have to do is select them and pull them into another folder, which I will name. So the images that we were just looking at, all five of these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I can select them individually by clicking on the Command key, like so, and deselect them that way as well. Or if I know that I want to import a group of images that are all together, so from this first overexposed image to the last one, I can click on the Shift key, like so, and that will select contiguous images. And if I want to make a collection, I can go over to the left in the bar on the left. It says collections, and click on the plus sign, and I will say create collection. And then this create collection box comes up, and I can name it. I can say bracketing. I don't want it to be inside a collection set, so I'll just say bracketing. And I want it to include the selected photos. And that is the default. It checks that, but you don't have to. You can just drag and drop things to that box afterwards to the collection. So I'll say create. And now I've created a collection of those images. So if I want to look at the information for those images, I can click on the letter I. And you look here, somebody has their speaker on. So I can see that this image was made at 1/25th of a second at f5.6 with the ISO set to 200. This shows the lens I was using and the specific focal length of the lens that I used for this image. It gives the date, the time. If I click on the letter I again, it toggles to a second screen, and it says 2EV. And that means that I used that plus minus button, the exposure compensation dial, and I set it to +2. And so this is telling me that I overexposed by 2 stops. It then says aperture priority, and so that tells me I shot it with the camera set to aperture priority. So I had chosen f5.6, and so the camera automatically set the shutter speed to the proper shutter speed and then +2 because I wanted it overexposed by 2 stops. Okay, so can you see me toggling back and forth between these images?
Yes.
Anybody? Yes?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yes.
So this is overexposed by 1 stop. So 2, 1, and that's looking pretty good again in the shadows, and even the midtones look good there. Excuse me. But the highlights are way too bright. This is normal, and the shadows are looking a little bit dark. The highlights are looking better. And now this is a -1, and you can see up in the upper left it says -1 EV. And so the shutter speed has changed from started at 1/125th of a second at 1/25th of a second at the +2, and it was then set to a 50th of a second at +1, 1/100th of a second at normal, and now 1/200th of a second at -1, and 1/400th of a second at -2. And you can see really at -2, it's just unacceptably dark. The shadows have almost disappeared. They're almost like a black hole. The midtones, the bricks here and the grass and stuff, those are way too dark. And even the high, the brighter areas are looking actually pretty good. And only the very brightest highlights are still highlights. So again, here's the overview. +2, +1, normal, -1, and -2. Okay, so that is bracketing. Any questions on that? Okay. Okay. Let us see if I'm just gonna, I will turn off Eileen's sound so that we can hear a little better. Um, Let me go back to, whoops. So back to the assignment, ISO. For the ISO, I want you to go probably outside, but that's up to you. You'll find this easier if you do this outside. And I want you to shoot the same scene, like 8 times for however many whole stop ISO ratings your camera has. So if you look here at number 1 ISO and then go down to the fourth little indentation, photograph the same scene at each available whole stop ISO rating. For example, 50, 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400. However high your ISO ratings go on your camera, you may have higher ones, 12,800, 25,200. I think that, no, 25,600. So if your camera goes that high, go ahead and use those. But again, only the whole stop numbers. Don't use the intermediate ones or you'll end up with like 30 images, which you probably don't want to make, and I don't necessarily want to see that many. So let me just bring up an example. That's not a good one. Just one moment. Okay, sorry. Be one from this winter. Let's see what we have. Excuse me. So, here's how it was turned in, which is what I want to see. So the person's name, assignment number 1, and then 3 folders, bracketing equivalent exposures, ISO. And then the ISO, I'd like to see the titles changed to the specific ISO number. So you can see 100, 2, 4, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400. Presumably 6400 was the highest ISO rating that this student's camera had. And so I will open those up and share these. Oops. That's not what I wanted to do. Okay, so this image was shot with the ISO set to 100. And can you see I brought up the information on this image? I have a
Yes.
separate little window open. Yes? Okay, good. So I can tell what the settings were. So this is showing what's called the metadata about the image. Um, it was shot in auto exposure with aperture priority, and the aperture was set to f/29. The exposure time was 1/8 of a second, and so it says here exposure bias value is 0, so that plus minus sign was set to 0. Let's find the ISO. So here it says recommended exposure index at 100. And now let me switch to the highest one, which is 6400. Notice, can you see that I changed that, by the way? I don't know if you can. Let me change it. So this one was shot with the ISO set to 6400. And because it's a much more sensitive rating, uh, which requires less light, the photographer was able to use a faster shutter speed. So the last one was shot at 1/8 of a second, which is really slow, and it was blurry because it recorded the person's body motion. This image was made at 1/512th of a second, which is much faster, and it freezes the motion. So it's much sharper in that respect. In terms of the quality of the image, I don't know if you can see that as well, but you're starting to be able to see these little blobs of color and things that don't really belong there, although this camera does pretty well. But if you can see these little black blobs, black and white, little blobs of color, purple in here, and different greens that don't really belong there. Those are because of the higher ISO rating. And the higher the ISO rating you use, the more of these little, what are called artifacts, the more of these things that don't belong there will appear. So let me just go to this lower ISO image. And although it's blurry, as I said, because the camera moved, the quality in terms of artifacts is much greater. You don't have any of those blobs of color and little dots of grain that you see with the higher speed ISO rating. So that's what I want you to do for ISO. I want you to choose a place and photograph the same thing for as many ISO whole stop ISO ratings you have. Okay. The third part of the assignment is equivalent exposures, which is what we went over last time in class, so to speak. And equivalent exposures is making use of the other shutter speeds and apertures other than what your light meter says is correct. So you want to let in the same overall amount of light because in this case you believe your light meter, but for various reasons you may not want to use that specific combination of numbers. So we talked about this in terms of speed and stopping motion or freezing motion or showing motion. So we said that the faster the shutter speed you use, the faster the motion you can stop of something that's moving in front of the camera. And so I used as an example I don't know what I used as an example. So let's say um, the tennis player Serena Williams serving a ball at 125 miles an hour, a tennis ball, and you want to capture that ball just as it leaves her racket. And that ball is traveling very, very quickly. And in order to freeze the motion of that ball, to stop it midair, you need to use a really fast shutter speed. So if you use a slow one, a 60th of a second, a 30th, or even slower, you won't even see the ball, or you may not see the ball. It's moving so quickly. So you need to use a fast shutter speed for something moving quickly. If you do want to show motion, then you need to use a slower shutter speed. And the slower the subject is moving, the slower the shutter speed you'll need to use in order to show a blur of motion. In either case, when you change the shutter speed, you change the amount of light entering the camera. And so to compensate for that, so that you don't over or underexpose, you need to change the size of the aperture as well. So if you let less light in through the shutter, you'll let more light in through the aperture. If you let more light in through the shutter, you'll let less light in through the aperture. And so that's what I wanted to see with equivalent exposures. I again wanted you to photograph the same thing set with different aperture settings, allowing the camera or you to set the appropriate shutter speed as well. So let me just bring up 2 other images. So can you see this image? I'm not saying that it's the world's greatest image in terms of composition, but it's an image of a saw and then some things covered with tarps. Can you guys see that?
Yeah, we can.
Great. I am going to keep checking with you about that because sometimes when I do shares through Zoom, it doesn't show the right thing. So, okay, thank you. So this image was made with the aperture set at f4, so a large, physically large aperture. The diameter of the aperture is large, and the shutter speed was at 80th of a second with ISO at 100. And in some ways, it's similar to doing the ISO images, but in this case, you'll change the aperture, the f-stop, instead of the ISO. So I'm skipping all the in-betweens, but I'm just showing the largest aperture and then the smallest aperture. So with the smallest aperture, the photograph in terms of composition is the same, but the f-stop used is f25 and the shutter speed 1/40th of a second. So the main there are 2 things that are different. The first is that if you look at the background in this image, it's out of focus. Not incredibly, but it's not as sharp as the saw in the foreground. In this image, by the way, can you see that I'm changing them?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. So in this image, the background is sharp. And that is because the size of the aperture changed. And that's what we'll talk about today. The effect of changing the aperture on the image. So that's what I expect to see in these images, the equivalent exposure images, that as the aperture gets smaller, the background will become more and more in focus. One other thing that I think is interesting about shooting with a small aperture as opposed to a large one is what happens to highlight areas, like points of light. So if you look at this bright area on the upper left part of this saw in the foreground, with the large aperture, it's really bright, but that's it. With the small aperture, it starts to become this kind of star-like effect. And you can see that in the background as well. In the bright areas, it's kind of glowing. It's shooting out these little spokes of light, which you don't get with a large aperture. So if you see images made at night, for example, with street lights, and they appear to be little stars with these spokes of light coming out, that image was made with a small aperture, as opposed to an image made with a large aperture where that light would just look like a blob of bright light. Okay, so that's what I expect to see with the equivalent exposure images. All right, all the same thing, all at the same exposure, neither lighter nor darker, and just seeing these subtle changes, probably, maybe not quite as subtle, in how much of the frame is in focus from the background, from the foreground to the background. Okay. Okay, so any questions on that? Okay, great. Okay, so last time we talked about, again, equivalent exposures and bracketing, and certain situations in which you would not abide by what your light meter says is correct, or you might not want to. And if there are no questions on those, anybody? I want to move on to something called depth of field. And depth of field is how much information in the frame is in focus from the area closest to the lens to the area furthest away. You can have images that have very little in focus, aside from what you've focused on, and that's called shallow depth of field. You can have images that have everything in focus from the foreground to the background, and that's called great depth of field. So I just want to bring up the notes, the class notes on depth of field. And we'll talk about depth of field, what it is, and why we might want to change it. So let me just share the screen here. So I've gone into modules in Canvas, and they're the basics, the lens, aperture, shutter, equivalent exposures, depth of field. It's in the wrong order. Okay. Okay, so can you guys see these notes here?
Yes,
Okay,
we can.
thank you. So depth of field, the area in or of the image that is in focus. Specifically, the area in front of and behind the point of focus that is in focus. Let me ask you this also. Can you also see a little picture of me still somewhere? Or is it just the desktop?
We can still see you.
Still see me a little bit? Okay.
Yeah.
Great, great, thank you. So when you focus on a point, there's always a certain amount of space in front of and behind that point that is also in focus. So if you focus on my nose, for example, there's a certain amount of space in front of that nose, my nose, and behind my nose that is also in focus. And that area or amount of space is the depth of field. And it can be a tiny amount of space or a huge amount of space. The ratio of that space is the same. So of the total amount of space that's in focus, 1/3 will be in front of my nose and 2/3 behind. And so you could have 1 foot in focus and 2 feet in focus in front of my nose and 2 feet behind my nose in focus. It could be 3 feet and 6 feet, or 5 feet and 10 feet, but the ratio is the same. 1/3 in front to 2/3 behind, or a ratio of 1 to 2. But back to the overall depth of field. So there are three things that affect depth of field. And the first is the aperture, the size of the aperture. And that's the thing that we as photographers use when we purposely want to change how much space in the frame is in focus, when we purposely want to change the depth of field. So I'm sure you've seen images, often landscapes, where everything from the foreground to the background is in sharp focus. So that is great depth of field. Many portrait photographers use shallow depth of field, where the subject is in focus, but the background may be out of focus, and sometimes the foreground as well. So that is called shallow depth of field. And when we as photographers purposely change the depth of field, we generally do it by changing the size of the aperture. So if you saw when we were looking at the equivalent exposure images, the image that was made with the large aperture, f4, was sharp in the foreground, and the background was out of focus. In the image that was made with the aperture set to f25, which is a small aperture, both the foreground and the background were in focus. So again, the size of the aperture controls the depth of field in the image. Okay, so let me keep going here. So, aperture. The smaller the aperture, and that is the larger the f-stop number, the greater the depth of field. And I have shortened this from depth of field just to DOF, so I abbreviated or whatever. And then the larger the aperture, for example, f2, the shallower the depth of field, the less will be in focus. And again, sorry, these are the definitions. Great depth of field when most or all of the frame from the foreground to the background is in focus. Shallow depth of field when very little of the frame, aside from the point of focus or your subject, is in focus. So why does the aperture control the depth of field? Well, if we look at the camera from the side and what's being photographed, let's say we have focused on this stick figure, and the light from that stick figure, the reflected light, enters the camera through the lens, is focused at a point in the lens that we said is called the nodal point, and is then projected back into the camera all the way back to the sensor, the digital sensor, or the film plane. But generally, when we photograph things, there are other things in the frame aside from what we have focused on. So in this case, there's a flower in the foreground, a building in the background. And light from those areas also enter the camera and are focused at a point, and then enter the camera or enter into the camera body. Those areas, the light from those areas, the flower and the building, focus at different points. Because they are at different distances from the lens, they are focused at different points as well. And those points, called circles of confusion, it's a great name, isn't it? These points focus at different points, and so they appear out of focus. But as we stop down the aperture, as we make it smaller and smaller, the light entering the camera is bundled. It's forced to come closer and closer, all those rays of light. And as we do that, these circles of confusion are forced to come closer and closer to the nodal point, to the point of focus. They never actually reach it, but they appear to. And so the light from these other areas, as the aperture gets smaller, the light from those areas appears to be in focus as well as the light from your point of focus. And so that gives us great depth of field, where everything at least appears to be in focus from the foreground to the background. You do not have to memorize this part, but what you do need to know is that the size of the aperture affects the depth of field, affects how much of the frame will be in focus from the foreground to the background. You need to know that a small aperture will give you greater depth of field, and a large aperture will give you shallow depth of field. Okay, so as I said, the aperture is the thing that we as photographers use to purposely change depth of field. But there are two other things that affect the depth of field. And the second of the things that affect depth of field is the focal length of the lens. So we said the focal length of the lens, how long the lens is. And shorter lenses give us a wider angle of view. Longer lenses give us a narrower angle of view. And the general rule is that the shorter the lens, or the wider the angle of view, the greater the depth of field will be. And the longer the lens, normal and then out into telephoto, the shallower the depth of field will be. And that is because although all lenses have the same f-stop numbers within the lens's parameters, so for example, all lenses have f8, or there are very, very few lenses that don't. All lenses have f8, but the diameter of the aperture at f8 is not constant from lens to lens. That is dependent on the focal length of the lens. So I just want to show you why that is. And so if you have two lenses, a 24 millimeter lens and an 80 millimeter lens, so a wide angle lens and a mildly telephoto lens, and we set both to f8, the diameter of f8 will not be the same. So the diameter of the aperture is equal to the focal length of the lens divided by the f-stop number. And so if we take the 24 millimeter lens and divide it by 8, which is the f-stop number, we get 3 millimeters. And if we take the 80 millimeter lens and divide it by 8, which is the f-stop number, we get 10 millimeters. And so you can see that f8 on the shorter lens is considerably smaller than f8 on the longer, more telephoto lens. And since a small aperture gives us greater depth of field, the wide-angle lens will give greater depth of field than the telephoto lens will, even though both are set to the same f-stop number. Okay, and then we have this. While all lenses may have the same f-stop numbers, the size of that f-stop, f8 for example, will vary depending on the focal length of that lens. And then as seen as above, what we just did. Okay, so the focal length of the lens is the second thing that affects depth of field. The third thing is the distance from your subject, or the point of focus, the point at which you have focused. And the further you are from your point of focus, the greater the depth of field will be. And the closer you are to the subject or point of focus, the shallower the depth of field will be. So that is because of the angle at which the light enters the frame. So when you are far away from a subject, the angle of the light entering the camera is much smaller than the angle of the light entering the frame or camera when you focus on something that's very close. So you can see this angle increases, gets larger as you come in closer to the subject. And lenses have trouble, you might say, focusing on things that are closer. So check out your lenses and see what the closest point is that you can focus, that the lens will allow you to focus. And you'll notice that closer than a certain point, you can no longer focus. The lens just won't focus anymore. And the longer the lens, the more telephoto the lens you have, the further back you have to be. So lenses, you might say it's all the lens can do to focus on the thing that you're focusing on, and it can't really handle the things at other distances as well to make the depth of field greater. The other things will still affect depth of field. So if you use a very small aperture and you come in close, the depth of field will be greater than it would be if you use a very large aperture, but the depth of field is almost certain to still be pretty shallow. As you back up away from the subject, then the other elements, the size of the aperture and the focal length of the lens, will have more of an effect on the depth of field. Okay, so depth of field is the area or the amount of space in the frame that is in focus from the foreground to the background. Shallow depth of field is when you have very little in focus aside from what you focused on. Great depth of field is when you have most or all of the frame in focus from the foreground to the background. There are three things that affect depth of field. The aperture. A large aperture gives you shallow depth of field. A small aperture gives you great depth of field. The second thing is the point of focus. A long lens will give you shallow depth of field. A short lens will give you great depth of field. And the distance from the subject or point of focus, I was doing it in this order. So the closer you are to the subject, the shallower the depth of field, and the further away from the point of focus, the greater the depth of field. Okay, so that is depth of field. Any questions on depth of field?
Can you release the notes on Canvas?
They are on Canvas, or they should be.
I just checked and I can't see it.
Really? Oh, Lord, that's terrible. I apologize. Okay, they should be there now. I hope.
They are.
Okay.
They're up there now.
Sorry
Yep.
about that. Okay, so they are now there. So these notes are there, and I just want to look at examples of depth of field to show you what I mean. And the second assignment deals with depth of field. Okay, but let's look at some images first. So let me just bring this up. Kind of slow, sorry. Don't know why it's so slow. Goodness. Well, while it's taking its time loading PowerPoint, let me just find the correct images I want to show you. Okay, can you see these aperture images of the aperture? Anybody?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
So before we get specifically to depth of field, I'll just go over a few of the other things we've talked about. So here are examples of of the aperture and what happens to the size of the aperture as you change the f-stop number. So again, the larger the aperture, the smaller the f-stop number, or the smaller the f-stop number, the larger the aperture. And as you stop down, going to larger f-stop numbers, the size of the aperture, the diameter of the aperture decreases. Okay. What happens when you change the shutter speed? And we'll talk about motion a little more in somewhat more depth a little later on. But in this example, you can see on the far left photograph, all of them, photographs of a fan in motion. And the first image was made with the shutter speed set at 1/15th of a second. And it's very, very blurry. All you see is a blur, a circular blur around the center of the fan. 2 stops faster, so from a 15th of a second, you have a 30th, and then this image made at a 60th of a second. It's still very blurry, but now you can kind of make out the shapes of the blades of the fan. Another 2 stops faster, so from a 60th of a second, you'd get 1/125th of a second, and then here, 1/250th of a second. And it is still blurry, but you can definitely make out the individual blades, and you can actually see the rivets on the blades that hold the blades onto the center of the fan. And then finally, at 1/1000th of a second, the motion is completely stopped. Or at least we assume that the fan was actually in motion, and the motion was stopped with this very fast shutter speed. So again, another 2 stops faster from 1/250th of a second to 1/1000th of a second. Equivalent exposures, so these are examples. They are different combinations of numbers than the ones I used in my example. So again, these are just possibilities that you might get in different lighting situations with different ISO ratings. But the general rule is the same. If we look at the left, there's a small aperture, f16, with a slow shutter speed, 1/8 of a second. And as the size of the aperture increases, and we let more light in to the camera through the aperture, the shutter speed will increase. So less light would be allowed in through the shutter. So the larger the aperture, the faster the shutter speed, and the smaller the aperture, the slower the shutter speed. Okay. What happens to the framing of your image when you change the focal length of the lens? So let me just go to... Can you guys all see this wide angle to telephoto diagram with pictures? I hope.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, great. So I like this diagram because the cones show you the actual angle of view at these different focal lengths of the lens. And as you extend the lens out, these cones get longer and narrower. So if we look at the image down on the lower, not the lowest, but the lower left, it says 11 millimeters. It also says EFL. That stands for effective focal length. And that is because cameras that have full-size sensors, remember the sensor that is the size of the 35 millimeter piece of film, those are the focal lengths that are used as a standard. With cameras that have smaller sensors, The lenses actually have different focal lengths. They actually have wider focal lengths to give the same amount of information that you get in the lenses that are used with full frame sensors. And so that's why they give the effective focal length as well. But we'll use these. So 11 millimeters down here is a very wide angle of view. You have a lot of information. You have this water, a lake in the foreground, a hillside, and all the way back in the distance you have a castle and other hills and the sky. In the next image it goes to 18 millimeters, and then again on the left 35 millimeters, so just above 11 at 35 millimeters you can see that the image has been cropped essentially. So it's as if we've come in closer, and the foreground, the extreme foreground of the lake is now gone. The edges, of this hill, all this sort of reddish area, that's gone. We can see the castle much better. And then on the right, 55 millimeters, and then back on the left, 125 millimeters. So the length of the lens is expanding, is getting longer. Extended, I should say. And now at 125 millimeters, which is telephoto, we can't see that there's a lake at all. All we see is the castle with a hill in the background and a little bit of sky. And then finally, all the way out at 400 millimeters, so this narrowest portion of the lens, it's really just the castle. We can see the turrets and the chimney and the rooftop and so on, and a tiny bit of hill, but that's it. So the long lens it allows us to come in very close to a specific point in our overall field of vision. So the difference between 400 millimeters in the upper right and 11 millimeters in the lower left is enormous. You can hardly see the castle at all with the wide angle of view, and you can't see anything but the castle with the narrow angle of view that we get with the long lens. Okay. Sorry. So the effect of changing the ISO on the image, so this is what we'll be looking at, also looking at in your first assignment. And this example starts with ISO 1600, which is already a pretty sensitive setting, but the quality is still pretty good. You can make out the numbers on this ruler or measuring tape at the top. You can read the text on the bottom, and there aren't very many artifacts or blobs of things that don't belong there. But as the ISO increases from 1600, 3200, 6400, 12,800, you can see that the quality really degrades quickly. And so the images are less and less sharp, and there are more of these blobs of colors that don't belong there, dots and so on. So at 12,800, you cannot read the measuring tape at all, nor can you read the text in the foreground at all. And there are all these blobs of color that don't belong there, purples and greens, oranges, that just appear apparently out of nowhere. So the higher ISO rating allows you to photograph in low light situations, but you can see what happens to the quality of the image. Now, newer, especially the high-end cameras, handle dark situations much, much better than somewhat older cameras or cheaper cameras. So even my, of course I don't have it here, my digital camera, which is a nice, it's a kind of mid-range Nikon that does not have a full-size sensor, makes lovely images, but it doesn't handle higher ISO ratings very well. So even 400 and higher, I can see the difference in the quality of the images. Whereas I've had work turned in by students with the ISO 12,800 or 25,600 that look really beautiful, you know, as if I had shot it at my 400. So newer cameras definitely have improved in that respect anyway. And another example of the same, and this is a newer Lumix. I always want to say Lumix. Lumix, I think, made by Panasonic, and there's you can see a difference in the quality, but even at 25,600, it's not that grainy. You're starting to see color shifts a bit, and you can see, you know, that there are blobs in these areas, but considering how high the sensitivity is, it looks pretty good. Okay, depth of field. So this example shows us shallow depth of field. And as you can see up at the top, it says the aperture was set to f2, which is a very large aperture. Many of your cameras will not open up all the way to f2, especially if you have a zoom lens. The maximum aperture for zoom lenses is usually 3.5. But at any rate, this camera's lens was set to f2, and it gives us three areas, A, B, and C. And B is the point of focus. So this boy on the right, who is kind of midway back in the area that's in the frame. And so the foreground, the boy in the foreground, area A, is out of focus. And the man in the background, area C, is also out of focus. So again, this image shows us shallow depth of field, where very little of the frame, except for the point of focus, is in focus. This next image shows us great depth of field. And so now the composition is the same, but the aperture setting is different. It's been stopped down from f2 to f16, and that's a difference of 6 stops. So from f2 to f16 is stopping down by 6 stops. And now, not only is of course, the point of focus is still in focus. Now the foreground is in focus, and the background in focus. And although in terms of composition, these images are essentially, they are the same, the effect is totally different. Because when we have areas that are out of focus, our eyes are immediately directed to the areas that are in focus. We don't like to look at things that are out of focus. And so we immediately go to the area that is in focus. But when everything is in focus, the emphasis is different. In fact, maybe we're not quite sure where we're supposed to look eventually. The area in the foreground is usually where we tend to look first. And if that's in focus, we'll tend to go back there. And so even though the photographer actually focused on point B, the boy that's further back, because the boy in the foreground is in focus, we tend to look at him more. Our eyes are definitely moved around the frame because there are all these other areas that are in focus. So we kind of circle around, but return to the point of focus. So this next image shows us from the side what was going on when the photographer was making the image. And you can see the photographer, the boy in the foreground, the boy in the midground, and the man in the background. And then below it shows a lens. And this is an older lens. This is an older example. But one nice thing about older lenses is that many of them give what's called a depth of field preview. And so if you look at the lens, you can see there's a central hatch mark, and then it shows the f-stop settings, 2, 4, 8, 11, 16. It kind of skips a few in terms of printing the numbers. And then below that is the actual aperture ring that you move to change the size of the aperture. And what this is showing is how much of the frame will be in focus at different f-stops. So the outer ring of the lens is the focusing ring that you move in order to change the point of focus. And on this lens, it tells us those distances. So it goes from what we can see 4 feet, 5, 6, 8, 10, 15, 25, and then finally infinity. And this is showing us or telling us that at f2, this very small area is in focus. So roughly from 6.5 to 7.5 feet. And so that's about 1 foot, a depth of 1 foot. And so that's why the boy in the middle is in focus, but the boy in the foreground and the man in the background are out of focus. When the aperture is changed and stopped down, now you can see that the amount of space that is in focus has expanded. So if we look down at the lens, f16 gives us from just ahead of 5 feet, so about maybe 4 3/4 feet, all the way back to maybe 12 or maybe 13 feet. So approximately 8 feet are now in focus because the aperture was stopped down, it got smaller, the amount of space that's in focus was expanded. And now we can see the boy in the foreground in focus, and of course the point of focus, the boy in the midground, and the man in the background, all in focus because the size of the aperture was changed. Okay. So, okay. Any questions on that? Anybody? No? Can you guys see this using aperture and shutter together?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we can.
Good, thank you. So these next few examples will show you what happens both to motion and depth of field. So in this first example, is that right? This first example, a slow shutter speed was used, 1/8 of a second, and a relatively small aperture, f16. And so we have great depth of field because we've used a small aperture. And so we can see the foreground and then all the way to the background. Everything is in about the same sharpness. There's stuff moving in the foreground, and if we hadn't been told what it was, we might not know that these are birds moving around. We just see a kind of blur of something there. In this next example, the aperture has been stopped down by 2 stops, so from f2 to f4, and the shutter speed is now 2 stops faster at 1/125th of a second. It's actually 3 stops. 15, yeah, it's 3 stops, but anyway, sorry. And so now the depth of field has decreased somewhat. So the trees and this area in the very, the furthest part of the frame, those areas are now somewhat out of focus. They're certainly not so out of focus that we can't tell what's there. And with the faster shutter speed, we can now see that these are birds in the foreground. The birds that are not moving are sharp. The birds that are moving are still blurry because 1/125th of a second, though a lot faster than 1/8 of a second, is still not fast enough to freeze the motion of the flapping wings. Then finally, oh, no wonder, silly me. Okay, sorry. Anyway, finally, f2, the largest aperture that this lens can open up to, has given us really pretty shallow depth of field. So only the foreground is actually pretty sharp, and the background falls off pretty quickly. But the fast shutter speed of 5/100th of a second has really frozen almost all of the motion of these birds. There are just a couple of them whose wings are still moving faster than a 500th of a second can stop. But for all of the rest, a 500th of a second has frozen the motion of the bird's wings. So again, there's the kind of opposite. So the larger the aperture, the shallower the depth of field, and the faster the shutter speed you can make use of, so motion is stopped. And so if you're someone who looks at a lot of sports photography, perhaps you've noticed that a lot of sports photography freezes motion. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And the depth of field is really shallow. So the subject is in focus, but the background generally is not. And that is because the photographer is using a fast shutter speed. The photographer also is probably using a long or telephoto lens in order to get these beautiful close-up images of someone out on the field, on the football or soccer field or on a tennis court, without physically being right there. And again, the longer lenses also give us shallow depth of field. So the combination of using a large aperture and a long lens will give really pretty shallow depth of field. And so we'll look at some examples of those in a moment. Okay. So this example of these flowers shows us what happens to changing the depth of field when you come in very close to your subject. So remember earlier I said that when you're close to your subject, the depth of field will be shallow, even with a small aperture. The small aperture, as we can see here at f32, definitely gives greater depth of field than the large aperture at f5. But the depth of field is still shallow. So if we look at the image, or the part of the image that was made with a small aperture on the left, we can still see what's going on in the background. We can see that there are flowers and the foliage and maybe other plants and maybe a little bit of, I don't know, earth or chips or something in the background. The flower that's focused on obviously is in focus, and the flower that's below it and slightly behind it is also pretty well in focus. And then the depth of field falls off and the image starts to be, less sharp. On the right, where the aperture was set to f5, the depth of field is incredibly shallow. So again, the flower that was focused on in the foreground is in focus. But by the time we get to this flower that's slightly below and behind it, the depth of field has already fallen off and the flower is out of focus. The next one behind is really out of focus. And the background is so out of focus that we have no idea what it really is. Having looked at the other side, we can kind of extrapolate that it's the same, that there are other, flowers and foliage. But really what we see is just a study of blurs, of areas of different colors and light and dark. A much more impressionistic sort of feel. Anyway, so that is what happens when you come in very close to your subject, if your lens allows you to do so. You can change the depth of field, but you will not, or it's very difficult to achieve actual great depth of field. This image was made by a photographer named Ansel Adams, and some of you may have heard of Ansel Adams. He was one of the...
Fuck you.
What's that?
I,
Somebody speaking? Do I hear a voice? No? Okay, please do, if you have questions or comments, please just interrupt me and ask, okay? Or comment. So this image was made by an American photographer named Ansel Adams. He was one of the very well-known black and white photographers of the 20th century. Um, he, for many people, especially my age and older, when they think of black and white photography, images of the sort that Adams made come to mind. These landscapes, broad landscapes, with whites and blacks, but a beautiful tonal range in between. Landscapes, Adams photographed primarily in the West and the southwestern United States. So this image was made in the eastern part of the Sierra Nevada, looking west to a mountain called Mount Williamson, and it shows us very, very great depth of field. Everything from the foreground, this rock, to the background, Mount Williamson, and the sky out at infinity, everything is in focus. Adams was a member of a group, the founding member of a group that called themselves the F64 group. And F64 is a very, very small aperture that you find on lenses used with large format cameras. So 4 by 5 inch or 8 by 10 inch view cameras, which is what Adams generally used. And the members of this group felt that photographers could use very great depth of field rather than shallow depth of field. They felt that, and I'm putting words in their mouths, kind of, but that shallow depth of field was almost cheating, that it was so easy to guide the viewer's eyes into the frame using shallow depth of field. Because with shallow depth of field, you have only one area that's in focus, and everything else is out of focus, and the viewer's eyes are directed, obviously, to the area that's in focus. With great depth of field, where everything is in focus, you have to use composition to direct the viewer's eyes into and around the frame. And this is what the members of the F64 group felt photographers should do. And so if you look at this image, I think you can see that it's carefully thought out. Adams uses form and areas of light and dark to guide our eyes into and around the frame. So the boulder in the foreground immediately pulls us in, and it has a vaguely triangular or pyramidal shape. And then we're directed back into the frame along the area of light, along these boulders, to these mountains in the foreground, well, background for us, these pyramids, and then an inverted pyramid where all this beautiful God light comes in, and the clouds are sitting in there, and then finally Mount Williamson in the background with more clouds over. And so our eyes are directed to go back into the frame in this way. The corners are all a little bit darker, and that's called vignetting. And that also is used to direct our eyes into the center of the frame and keep them there. And so many photographers who printed in the darkroom would do something called burning, and that is adding more exposure to the edges of the frame to make them a little bit darker, sometimes a lot darker, to contain the image. In Lightroom, we will do that by using a little slider that allows us to make the edges either darker or lighter. So that's that. The darkroom techniques that were used in the silver wet darkroom have been carried over into Lightroom, but we just control those things on the computer rather than under an enlarger in the darkroom. This image was also made by Ansel Adams, who was definitely not known for making portraits. As I said earlier, many portrait photographers use shallow depth of field in order to isolate their subjects from surrounding information that might compete with the subjects. As you can see here, the depth of field is not shallow, it's great. So everything from the foreground, that is the area closest to the lens, which is probably this man, whose name was Orville Cox, everything from his elbow back to the next subject, the painter, the American painter Georgia O'Keeffe, and all the way back to infinity, the clouds in the sky, everything is in sharp focus. And yet the clouds don't really compete with the subjects. They are one, you might say. Great expression on her face, isn't it? It's kind of mischievous. We don't know what she's up to or plotting with respect to her neighbor here, her co-subject. But Adams photographed them from below, so he's kind of elevated them in the frame. We don't know where they're standing. And so he's literally, in visual terms, he's literally placed them up in the clouds. And so figuratively, we see this as well, that they have been elevated, that they are important. And so in this case, the great depth of field works well, putting these subjects in the same plane visually as the clouds. Okay. So this is one of my personal favorites of examples of great depth of field because it's so extreme. The photographer who made this image was named Bill Brandt, and he was active from the 1920s actually into the 60s or 70s. He found a camera in a used, I don't know if it's camera shop or a thrift shop, that had belonged to a police department, and it had a fixed aperture that was really, really, really small. So it only had one aperture, but it gave images that had incredible depth of field, almost infinite depth of field. So if we look at this image, you can see everything from this ear, which is just a couple of inches from the camera, all the way back to infinity, the looming cliffs, the dark cliffs, the ominous clouds. Everything is in focus, and it gives a sort of surreal effect. The image, the frame is divided into three parts: the foreground, the midground, and the background. And so the ear is given essentially equal weight in the frame to the rocks on the shore and the ominous cliffs, and the looming cliffs, the ominous clouds. Brandt was friends with and was certainly influenced by some of the surrealist artists of the time, in particular the Belgian painter René Magritte. And I think that surrealist influence is really obvious in this image. This next image was made by a French photographer named Henri Cartier-Bresson. And Cartier-Bresson was also a very well-known photographer of the 20th century for different reasons than Ansel Adams. He made his living as a photojournalist, and he traveled quite a bit reporting events of the times from the 30s he died in 2005, I believe, so he was a very old man in his 90s. Maybe he died in 2003. Anyway, sorry. He had a different philosophy of photography. So Ansel Adams was something that he called pre-visualization. He could see, when he looked at a scene, he said that he could see in his mind's eye the finished print in front of him. And he devised a system of controlling the black and white process from beginning to end in order to achieve that goal. Not all of us photograph that way, all right? Another photographer, the American photographer Gary Winogrand, said, I photograph to see what things will look like as photographs. And that's a completely different philosophy than Ansel Adams's. He had maybe no idea of what it really would look like, and so he took a picture to find out. Cartier-Bresson, whose image we're looking at here, had a different philosophy, one that he called the decisive moment. And for him, that was a moment unlike any other. It could be the height of action, which is not necessarily what's going on here, or it just could be when all elements came together to make an image that either he thought was a possibility or maybe came together, serendipitously. This image was made in Kashmir in India in 1947, and it shows great depth of field. Unlike Adams, Cartier-Bresson didn't always use great depth of field. He changed the depth of field depending on the situation and what he wanted to emphasize in the frame. Notice the black line around the frame, and that indicates to us that the image is uncropped, that this is the full frame image. And Cartier-Bresson strongly believed in this, that you should do your composing in the camera whenever possible, that you shouldn't have to crop an image because you thought about the frame before you made it. And so he would, if the area of interest to him was just this woman with this extraordinary gesture of supplication, if that was the only area of interest to him, he would have come in closer and just photographed that, rather than making this image and then dumping everything else and just cropping in to this area. So that was his way of shooting, and printing it with the black line around the frame was his way of showing us that that is how he photographed. And almost all of his images, if you see his prints, all of them have a black line around them. There's only one I can think of that I know of that he cropped. Anyway, back to depth of field, you can see that the depth of field here is very, very great. So the foreground, these women up on a hill, are in focus. We can't see them as individuals because they have burqas and this clothing on that covers them, and we're seeing them from behind. So we have an impression of them, but we also see what they are seeing. This valley and the hills beyond and the beautiful sky. Had Cartier-Bresson chosen to use shallow depth of field, he could have isolated the women and thrown the background out of focus, and it would have been a very different image. We would have seen them and then maybe had an impression of what was beyond. And the image would have been about the woman's hands and their clothing and the beautiful pleats and designs of the clothing. But by using great depth of field, Cartier-Bresson shows us these women and what they are experiencing as well. So I guess we're running out of time a bit, but let me move on to show us some images dealing with shallow depth of field. This image was made by another American photographer named Gordon Parks, who photographed primarily in Harlem in New York City from the 1940s into the 1990s, I think. This image was made in 1963, and it's entitled Ethel Sharif in Chicago. And we see this one woman, presumably Ethel Sharif, in focus. And then these other women going back in the frame, who are all out of focus. So the depth of field here is shallow. Ethel Sharif is the point of focus. But then it's almost as if she's repeated over and over and over again, because we don't really see any of the other women as individuals. just as these forms that are repeated going back in the frame. In terms of the composition, I think it's really interesting that the photographer, Parks, used perspective in a different way. Usually, when people use perspective in a frame, we have the point going back into the frame, the perspective leading us back into the frame. And in this case, it's coming out at us. So it's a very different feeling and much more, I think, dynamic. As if this person is almost coming out of the frame at us. This is another image made by Gordon Parks of the boxer Muhammad Ali, very early in his career. And the depth of field is shallow. But notice that there are 2 points of focus. Ali's hands that are bandaged for boxing, and his head. So both areas are sharp. And that's because both of these areas are at the same distance from the lens. You can see that his body is behind his head and hands, so he's kind of leaning forward. So the depth of field falls off as you go back along his body and back in space. And it falls off beautifully. It's almost like a beautiful ink wash. It's somewhat more painterly in a way rather than photographic, except of course for the areas that are in focus. So we are drawn to those areas, and they tell us something about the subject. So even if we didn't know that this was Muhammad Ali, which we might not because we can't really see his face, the hands are emphasized. He was a boxer, and his head is emphasized as well. And he was known to be a thoughtful, intelligent man. He was well-spoken. He wrote poetry. So both of these elements about this person are emphasized. They're given equal weight in this image. This image was made by a Swiss photographer named Robert Frank, who came to this country from Switzerland in 1947 or 8 after the Second World War. And he received a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship grant to travel. He wrote a proposal, and he proposed to travel across the United States and photograph. So for about 18 months, between the years 1955 and 56, he drove around in a borrowed car across the United States, or zigzagged across the United States, recording what he saw. And he shot an incredible 800 rolls of 35 millimeter film, from which he culled, I think, 87 images that were published in a book called The Americans. And The Americans was published in 1958, first in Europe and then in the United States. And it was well received in Europe and very poorly received in the United States. And that was for probably 2 main reasons. And the first is that Robert Frank showed in America that America of the 1950s didn't want to see. So America of the 1950s was, there are many things about the 50s, but it was a boom time, a time of great prosperity, but only for certain people. So mostly for white upper class or upper middle class Americans. Other people were very disenfranchised, specifically people of color, Native Americans, African Americans, other people living on the fringes of society for whatever reasons. So Frank showed an America that people didn't want to see. Photographically, his images were rejected by many, and including many photographers, because they were considered to be sloppy in terms of composition, almost the opposite of Cartier-Bresson's images, which were so very carefully thought out and composed. And Robert Frank often shot from the hip without actually looking through his frame and focusing. He often found himself, I guess, in situations where open photography might not have been advisable or safe. Many of his horizon lines are not horizontal, and as is the case in this image, the area of the frame that, the part of the frame that is prominent is out of focus. And so that was considered to be really sloppy by a lot of photographers. That said, his work has become a classic and much, much copied. The road trip, the photographed road trip, and his images, you could say, are kind of proto-grunge. They sort of are the basis for grunge photography. And so they look. There's nothing in some ways in terms of composition that exceptional about them now, but in 1958 there was. Anyway, back to this image, we see this star arriving at a premiere, a movie premiere. So this was made in Hollywood. But she's out of focus. And again, we don't like to look at things that are out of focus. And so our eyes are directed back in the frame to the areas that are in focus. So to the people who are watching this star arrive, the people like us who are the observers. And we see some kind of interesting expressions, kind of thoughtful, peering over, trying to see what's going on. This woman, looking really interested and kind of adoringly at the star. And Robert Frank presents this woman, this star, in kind of in the way that we perceive the famous, larger than life, but a little bit out of focus and not quite real. And so Frank has really used this reversal of depth of field to give a specific effect by throwing the majority of the frame out of focus, this star. We are kind of forced to look at the area beyond that's in focus. Normally, in most photographs, we would expect to see this woman in the foreground in focus and the background out of focus. So the depth of field is shallow, but a kind of reversal of what we expect to see with shallow depth of field. Okay, so I will continue looking at depth of field next time. And we'll talk more about Lightroom next time. I hope that you will start getting your first assignment into me so I can look at them, grade them, and then we can look at them here. Your second assignment deals with depth of field, and so I'll go over that briefly right now and then go over it again on Thursday. It won't be due till next week. But let me just bring that up. Just a moment. Sorry, just one moment. Oh well, let me just go here. Okay, so the second assignment, ignore this due date, deals with depth of field. And in the first part, I give a description again of depth of field, what it is, and the three things that affect depth of field. And then I have a note here. Changing the depth of field may change the composition of the image. So when you just change the size of the aperture and you don't move or change the focal length of the lens, the composition stays the same. It's the depth of field that changes. But when you change either the focal length of the lens or your distance from subject, then not only will you change the depth of field, but the amount of information that you can see in the frame. So when you come in closer, you isolate a certain area. When you back up, you have more and more information. And that's the same thing, and the same thing happens when you change the focal length of the lens. When you use a long telephoto portion of the lens, you isolate one area, and as you shorten the lens, you get a wider angle of view and you include more and more information. Okay, the assignment. Read this before you begin the assignment. So you're going to, this is another 3-part assignment, and each part deals with one of the things that affects depth of field. So the size of the aperture, the focal length of the lens, and the distance from your subject or point of focus. In each of those sections, you're going to take that element and use that to change the depth of field while keeping the other 2 elements the same. So, for each situation, you will make one set of 2 images, one showing shallow depth of field, one showing great depth of field. This means that you are to make 3 sets of 2 images, a total of 6 images. Use one of the 3 things that affect depth of field for each set, i.e., oh, look at that. Those words got stuck together, sorry. I.e., for the first set, change the aperture and keep the point of focus, the focal length of the lens, and the distance from the subject unchanged. So you'll find a situation, and I'd like you to find a situation where there's space going back in the frame. So not just from like my face to the wall behind me, because that's not very much space. So imagine, if you will, we were in a classroom where there's space going back in the frame and also people and desks and chairs going back in the frame. So I will choose an area or a person to focus on, and I will choose a focal length of the lens, maybe 50 millimeters, and I'll choose a distance at which to stand, from the subject. And then for the first image, I will use a very large aperture, so the widest aperture my lens is capable of, f3.5, f2. And that will give me shallow depth of field. Then, without moving, without changing the lens, and without changing my point of focus, I'm going to stop down the aperture all the way to the smallest aperture that the lens is capable of. When I do that, of course, I will have to change the shutter speed as well so that I expose correctly. Because if I stop down from f2 to f22, that's a difference of 8 stops. And so my image will be completely black if I don't change the shutter speed as well. I may also have to change the ISO rating if I'm photographing inside to allow me to do that and not have to have like a 5-second exposure or something. But anyway, for the second image, you'll stop down the aperture and make it very small in order to make an image that shows great depth of field. So with the large aperture, I'll show shallow depth of field. With the small aperture, I will show great depth of field. That's the first part of the assignment. The second part is to change the focal length of the lens. So almost all of you have zoom lenses. If you do not, and you only have one fixed focal length lens, let me know. But most of you have zoom lenses that have a wide angle portion, a short portion, and then a telephoto portion, a longer portion. So in this case, in this set, you'll also make 2 images, one showing shallow depth of field, one showing great, using the focal length of the lens to change the depth of field. So you will choose, you'll be in a different situation than the first one, find another place to shoot, different subject. You'll choose the point of focus, You'll choose your distance from the subject. You'll choose a specific aperture, so let's say f8 or f11, and you'll change the focal length of the lens to show the change in depth of field. So you might want to be maybe, I don't know, 5-8 feet away from your subject. And to show shallow depth of field, you'll extend the lens out to telephoto, the longest portion of your lens, and make that image showing the subject and some of the background so that we can see that there's a change in depth of field. And then for the second image, you'll use the shortest portion of your lens, the wide angle portion, in order to show great depth of field. And you won't move, you won't change the aperture, so you should probably put the camera into aperture priority so that the camera will automatically figure out the equivalent exposures, but you keep the aperture constant. You have control over that. For the third set of images, you'll change the distance from the subject. So you'll keep the aperture the same, maybe f8 or f11. You'll keep the focal length of the lens unchanged, maybe 50 or 70 millimeters or whatever you choose to use. And you'll keep the point of focus the same, the subject, in yet another setting. And what you'll change is your physical distance from the subject. So to show shallow depth of field, you'll come in close to the subject. And to show great depth of field, you'll back up. So change the distance by probably at least 5 feet, I would say. Okay. Use the extremes for each of these factors. So F2 and F22, the widest angle portion of the lens and the most telephoto. Move in very close to your subject and then back way up. Okay. Do not use the flash. Do not use the auto or program modes. Use the aperture priority mode. Okay. So that is the second assignment, and it is due next Thursday. And so next Thursday is, today's the 14th, so that will be the 23rd of July. Wow, that's getting close. So our term, again, is only 6 weeks long. So we have to move more quickly, I guess. So on Thursday, we will be hopefully looking at some of your assignments, just finishing up looking at depth of field, and we will be working in Lightroom. So hopefully you all have Lightroom now, access to Lightroom, and have shot images to work on in Lightroom. So you should be, let me just go there. So in the modules, on Canvas, at the top, it says Lightroom, and there are Lightroom instructional videos and creating your personal Lightroom catalog. So in the instructional videos, if you haven't begun watching them, please do. So there's an overview of Lightroom, importing photos into Lightroom, rating those images, and there are different ways of rating and organizing them, creating collections and smart collections. So please watch these videos. They're not that long. It's not a huge commitment of time, but please do watch them so that I think this will help cement these things in your mind, and especially for people who are not attending our Zoom meetings, and obviously that doesn't include you guys because you're here, but hopefully you will be watching these. Also, creating your personal Lightroom catalog is just a step-by-step instructional. It's not a video, but it's like a lecture, how to create your catalog, and little diagrams and pictures of just what you need to do in order to make the catalog in Lightroom. Okay. So I want you guys to have watched those, and have made your own catalog, so that we can work on images together in Lightroom. And I will post some images for you guys to work on. You can also, you don't have to work on mine, but sometimes it helps, I find, to be working on the same images at the same time, so you can follow along with what I'm doing. Okay. So, any questions? Any questions or comments on what we've gone over thus far? So please do the readings. Also, sorry, we should go back to that. The readings in the modules. So we've gone over the basics. So please have read all of these things on the basics. The lenses, the different types of lenses, why you would use different lenses. Controlling the light entering the camera, the aperture and the shutter. So again, I want you to know the aperture and shutter settings that I gave you, which is not to say they're different from others, it's just that they are specific, the whole stop numbers. Equivalent exposures, there's a reading for it, and then my class notes. Don't worry about color temperature yet. And now depth of field. So a reading on depth of field, and then again the class notes that I just went over on depth of field. Those are not the right Zoom recordings, sorry. These Zoom meetings, why is that there? It shouldn't be there, sorry. Our Zoom meetings and the recording for last Tuesday became corrupted or didn't load correctly, so I couldn't load it onto YouTube, and it looks as if the 9th hasn't loaded yet. So I will make sure that the last lecture, last Thursday, is loaded here so that you can have access to it, and everything that we covered a week ago I went over again on Thursday, so it will all be in that lecture. Okay, so if there are no questions, we will reconvene on Thursday, on the 16th. And for any of you who celebrate Bastille Day, today's Bastille Day, so happy Bastille Day. Please be making photographs, taking pictures, and loading them into Lightroom and fiddling around, and we will continue with that on Thursday. And tomorrow I have, as always, office hours from 12:30 to 2:30. If you have any questions or comments or just want to drop in, I'll be here. Okay. Have a wonderful day. Take care, everybody.